Hi, my name is Jennifer Jennings, and I'm the Associate Pastor for Children and Discipleship at First Baptist Church in Marion, North Carolina. I have been in love with the Old Testament for a very long time. And one of the most fascinating books I have found is the book of Judges. Judges has these cycles throughout the chapters of the people turning away from God sending in a messenger to bring the people back, the people falling back in love with God again, and then the same cycle repeats itself over again. Judges 6 and 7 tell the story of Gideon, a man whom God called to lead the Israelites. Gideon is a good guy, quote unquote, but as most people are in scripture, Gideon is also a human guy. Gideon doubts that God will use him to save the Israelites. And I think that that's a very human reaction because we all have doubts about God being able to use us. So Gideon decides to give God two different tests. In the first test, he puts a wool fleece on the threshing floor overnight. And he tells God that when he wakes up in the morning, if the fleece is wet, but the ground is dry, then he'll know that God is telling the truth and that God is really going to use him to save the Israelites. When he wakes up in the morning, it's just as he had said, the fleece is wet, the ground is dry. But Gideon still doubts. So he puts a second test to God on the next night. And he tells God that he's putting the wool fleece back on the threshing floor. And if the fleece is dry, but the ground all around it is wet, then he will believe that God is telling the truth. The story ends with God proving God's self on the second night, but we really don't know what Gideon did after that. Did Gideon still believe? Did he still continue to test God? Eventually, he did save the Israelites from the Midianites, just as God promised, but we're not really surprised by that, now are we? I think sometimes we have expectations of God and how God is going to show up and offer us a sign. And often those expectations are wrong. Beth Moore tells a hilarious story in her book Audacious of a Easter Sunday service that she went to at her son and daughter-in-law's church in Houston, Texas. She was distracted during the communion instructions by trying to get her grandkids ready to go up for communion. So she didn't hear what was said, but she was standing in line and she noticed that there were all of these young couples that had recently joined the church that were serving communion on Easter Sunday. And she just felt like that was a wonderful thing. And then she noticed that there was a couple on the far end of the sanctuary that didn't have anybody with them. Nobody was in their line. And Beth, in her compassionate heart, was just horrified by that. So she got out of her line and she went over to receive communion from this couple. And as she received the bread from the wife, she was chewing it and chewing it and chewing it and chewing it. And it took her forever before she finally digested it. But later, at lunch after church, she was telling her family this, and there were tears in her eyes. And she said, I just know that God has a message for me in this, that I really need to digest his word. And her whole family started laughing, and her daughter tells her, Mama, that was the gluten-free line. Sometimes we have expectations of how God is going to offer us a sign. So I wonder, what can you do to change the expectations you're putting on God? Thank you.